Good evening, and welcome to the University of Chicago Francis and Rose Ewan campus in Hong Kong for our 5th Global Conversation live online event, 100-Year Lives in Asia, with Professor Kate Cagney. My name is Mark Barnico, and I'm the Executive Director of the University of Chicago Francis and Rose Ewan campus here in Hong Kong. The Ewan campus in Hong Kong is the University of Chicago's premier location in Asia, which represents our UChicago values of free and open discourse, rigorous debate, and the exchange of ideas. I encourage you to visit our website at www.uchicago.hk for news and information on the latest events hosted by the UChicago Ewan campus team. One of those programs is the UChicago Crowdsourcing COVID-19 History Project. You can visit the Alumni and Friends tab on our website for more details. There you can directly participate in this Ewan campus project by sharing your experiences during the pandemic. The 100-Year Lives in Asia series is one of the new programs developed and produced under the Ewan Lecture Series banner by Professor Kate Cagney and the UChicago Hong Kong team. Tonight, we are again delighted to welcome Professor Cagney from the University of Chicago's Sociology Department to host the 5th of 7 episodes of our program, 100-Year Lives in Asia. This evening, Professor Cagney will discuss our responsibilities across generations with an expert panel joining the discussion. It seems that the current pandemic has touched all of our lives. The COVID-19 crisis has strained and challenged our family and personal relationships. Many of us are geographically stranded in different parts of the world, and the pandemic prevents many of us from traveling to and supporting our aging parents or our children during this acute time of need, adding to everyone's stress. Tonight, we'll take a look at some of the regional data and experiences from our esteemed guests to better understand what our obligations are to our families as we all strive to live longer and more prosperous lives. The panel will touch on how we can deliver against family expectations during this pandemic. 2 remaining episodes of 100-Year Lives in Asia will continue to be broadcast through the month of July. Our 6th episode on July 16th is entitled Government Policy and then Social Safety Nets. We have an excellent panel already lined up for that event, so please plan to join us on July 16th. Now I'd like to get to the program and introduce the chair of 100-Year Lives in Asia, Kate Cagney. Professor Cagney is a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Chicago and the director of the Population Research Center, NORC, at the University of Chicago. Good morning, Kate. I'll turn the program over to you.
Great. Good morning, and thank you, Mark. As Mark said, last time we were together, we discussed the intergenerational transmission of wealth. And today, we will discuss responsibilities across generations more generally, or the intergenerational transmission of care. So I'd like to think that we started with money, now we're on love, and the care that may come with it. And of course, longer lives suggest deepening of relationships between and among generations. That said, as Mark alluded to, longer lives also suggest more years when one might need assistance with, potentially, a smaller number in the next generation to engage in such care provision, and we'll touch on that point. What might this mean for the family and family relationships? We'll think broadly about the intersection of demography, sociology, and social work, and how societal changes impact family-level interaction and decision-making. So let me tell you about the experts who will guide our conversation today. First, Ph.D. Teerawichitchainan holds joint appointments as Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and Co-Director of the Center for Population and Family Research at the National University of Singapore. Her research interests lie at the intersection of family demography, social gerontology, population health, social stratification, and Southeast Asia. Her current research examines the roles of family, policy, and social structure in explaining the well-being of older adults in Southeast Asia. This includes an ongoing study funded by the National Institutes of Health in the US on the long-term impacts of war and trauma exposure on health and well-being of older Vietnamese survivors in Vietnam, and a new project funded by the Singapore Ministry of Education on aging without children in Singapore and Thailand. Next, Dr. Vivian Lou is the director of Soap House Center on Aging and associate professor in the Department of Social Work and Social Administration at the University of Hong Kong. Her research interests focus on family gerontology, in particular family caregiving for dementia, stroke, end-of-life older adults, and social adaptation and mental health of Chinese older adults and family caregivers. She also has a keen interest in building evidence-based models to empower older adults and their families. Dr. Lou is assistant editor of Aging and Mental Health and editor of the Journal of Gerontology and Geriatrics. Dr. Lou has been appointed as a member of the Elderly Commission, Statistics Advisory Board, Community Investment and Inclusion Fund, and Elderly Academy Development Foundation of the HKSAR government. She's a fellow of the Gerontological Society of America and a council member of the Hong Kong Association of Gerontology. And third, Dr. Feinian Chen is professor of sociology and a faculty associate at the Maryland Population Research Center at the University of Maryland. Her research crosscuts a range of areas in demography, family sociology, gender, aging, and quantitative methodology. Her main research includes women's work and family, intergenerational relations, population aging, and health. Her work has been published in American Sociological Review, Social Forces, Demography, Journal of Gerontology, Social Sciences, Journal of Health and Social Behavior, Journal of Marriage and the Family, and Sociological Methods and Research. Her work has been funded by the National Institutes of Health in the US and the Hewlett Foundation. She's actively engaged in research in family transitions, gender dynamics, and their health implications in the diverse context of China, India, the Philippines, and the US. So Feinian, you'll be starting us out, so please set the stage for our conversation.
Good evening and good morning, depending where you are. Thank you so much for having me here. As Kate just mentioned, my research initially focused on China, but over the years, I have also included India and the Philippines in my research portfolio. So first, let me give you a sense of the population trends in these countries that I have studied in, and I think which are quite indicative of general trends in East, South, and Southeast Asia. So as you can see from this fertility chart right here, fertility has dramatically declined in these countries in the 50 years, with China leading the way, and India and the Philippines are following closely behind, and now these two countries only have fertility rate just a little bit above 2. And also you can similarly see improvement in life expectancy at birth. In the case of China, you see an increase of more than 30 years in the past 50 years. So an inevitable consequence of this dramatic decline in fertility and mortality is, of course, population aging. As you can see from this chart here, population age 65 has been increasing steadily for all these countries. And in the case of China, the speed is starting to accelerate because of its accelerated rate of decline in fertility and mortality. So as Kate mentioned earlier, fewer children means that fewer people are available to help for old age care. In addition, economic development and massive rural to urban migration means that aging parents are often left behind, sometimes with young children. So all of these call into the question of the sustainability of the traditional family support system. So with only about 5 to 7 minutes to speak on this subject, I finally decided on a set of contrasting words to organize my thoughts and as a starting point of our conversation. So the first words that comes to my mind are continuity versus change. So for these 3 countries that I have studied in, intergenerational ties are historically strong and continue to be so. Filial obligations have weakened somewhat, but remain to be a cornerstone of old age support. Co-residence with adult children has declined, but it's still at a very high level. It's also important to point out that although multi-generational households are culturally preferred, but most families are choosing it because it fulfills the needs of the family rather than passively conforming to some abstract norms. So there's a great deal of individual agencies right there. Also, what I want to mention is that traditionally, intergenerational relationship is very much anchored in obligations, but now there's tremendous growth in intergenerational intimacy. Against this backdrop of continuity and change, it's also time for us family researchers to update our toolboxes. Traditionally, family demographers overwhelmingly base our empirical research in the household or treat family as units. But now it is time to focus on family as relationship, as family have become more complex and diverse globally, and the meanings of family ties and obligations become blurred. For example, in my recent work, I argue that co-residence is too narrow a concept. In contemporary China, many parents no longer prefer living under the same roof as their children, but rather preferring a bowl of soup's distance, meaning living close by but not together. So in studying family as relationship, it's also important to point out that it's important to study within family dynamics. Co-residence promotes solidarity, but at the same time, it can also create tension or conflict due to the stress of caregiving, unpleasant interactions, or loss of independence. So recent work of mine suggests that it's important to take into account of the quality of intergenerational relationship in addition to living arrangements. In studying family as units or relationship, it's also important to point out consistency and heterogeneity. Take grandparenthood for an example. In my research, I study the health implications of grandparents caring for grandchildren, and the effect is definitely context specific. In all these countries that I have studied, grandparents play a very prominent role in caring for their grandchildren. But there exists tremendous heterogeneity. Some grandparents provide care when not living with their children. Others are custodial grandparents in skipped generational households. In India and China, paternal grandparents are more likely to provide care, but in the Philippines, maternal grandmothers are often more involved. There's also, of course, urban and rural divide and gender differences. So recognition of the diversity and differential needs of grandparents is essential to design policies that can address the challenges and difficulties these different groups face. Finally, I want to talk about challenges versus opportunities. There's no doubt that rapid population aging is bringing the traditional family support system to test. So this cartoon here describes the so-called 4-to-1 family structure in China, showing that adult children are burdened with caring for children and two sets of aging grandparents. But you can also see that, the middle generation, as I mentioned earlier, is getting a lot of help from their parents or the grandparents in terms of caregiving and resources. Some of my recent work has shown that it was indeed the grandparents are sandwiched between caring for the grandchildren and their own aging parents. There are also a lot of other positive signs. For example, as a result of growing intergenerational bond, parents can often draw on both grandchildren and children as sources for support later in life. The foundation of intergenerational ties is no longer just centered on responsibility, but also intimacy and love. I took the liberty of including a family picture here. My daughter, who is 15 right now, she actually is very close to her grandparents in China, and then they FaceTime regularly. Other research have also shown that because recent economic development offer the middle generation greater social mobilities, they're also able to use these resources to provide help and support for their parents later in life. So ultimately, the development of social policies promoting social security, health insurances, long-term care, and all of those are crucial to the maintenance of a strong family support system for rapidly aging societies. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Feinian, for that overview. And I hope we'll get back to these ideas of the definitions of grandparenthood and also the role of social media. Vivian, please share your work with us now.
Hi, Good day, everyone. Either you are in the morning, evening, or afternoon. So I'm Vivian Lou from the University of Hong Kong, South Pole Center on Aging. I'm now going to share with you, following Feinian's sharing on intergenerational solidarity and attention, I'm going to share with you a bit of my research on family caregiving, which I have been working on for over a decade of time. Today, I'm going to share on three main reflections I have based on my 10 years of study on family caregiving. That is how family caregiving is going to be changed or shifted to a new paradigm in a super-aged society. Then is the diversity of family caregiving in terms of demographics, relationships, and then how we can be more responsive in research, in policy, and in program. Because I'm a social worker background, and I'm really very much found to find an evidence-based way that we can better support family caregivers in our super-aged society. So my topic today is partnered shared care, the future of caregiving. So in the coming decades, we're going to observe a global phenomenon that is we call super-aged nations. So according to this graph, you can see that in 2030, there are quite a number of countries, including Japan, Germany, Italy, South Korea, France, Switzerland, UK, US, Australia, that would have older population that consists to almost 20%. And 21% is the threshold for us to define a super-aged nations. So in this sense, we're not going to face only the aging population, but also quite a lot of nations were moving into a super-aged nation. So what happened in Hong Kong? If you look at this graph, you will see that actually in the coming 5 years of time, Hong Kong is going to enter it into a super-aged society. That is in 2024. But then what happened in the coming another 10 years, that's only a decade of time, Hong Kong is going to move into, we call it ultra-aged society. That means we'll have over 28% of population that reached the old age. So what is the implications for us in terms of family caregiving, intergenerational care, and support? According to a recent study I conducted in Hong Kong on over 500 samples, we found that family caregiving becomes a very much contextualized phenomenon. The traditional view on family caregivers as middle-aged women who is taking care of their parents or parents-in-law is definitely has to be changed, because according to this study, you will find that in terms of age, even those in their 20s, they're now taking care of their family members. So we have those in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Of course, we have those in their 80s. They're still taking care of their family members. And then in terms of gender, the traditional view on the gender, that means the women, female-dominated caregiving responsibility or obligations must be changed, because based on my survey, that about 26.6% of caregivers, they are male, so that we do have to think about how we can have a society that we have a significant portion of male become a family caregiver. And then if you look at employment status, you can see that according to this sample that we recruited from the corporates and then the social enterprises, and then we have a majority of them who are still working. Of course, if you look at the age distribution and also the gender distribution, you would feel not surprised that we will have a significant majority of those people, family caregivers, they're still working, or some of them, they are part-time, and then they're self-employed, and then even we have 4.6% of them identify them as unemployed. That means they're seeking jobs, but they are not taking up a job. But then we look at the relationship, and traditionally it is children taking care of parents, but now it becomes so diversified. They are either taking care of their spouse, fathers, mothers, father-in-law, mother-in-law, grandparents, and even some of them are taking care of their older siblings. This phenomenon has not only been identified in Hong Kong. Now I give you a summary of a report that released based on Singapore. If you look at this, you can see the diversity on gender, age, employment status, and marital status have also been observed in Singapore. So what we are going to face now is that we must have a future-anchored, responsive, carer-centered research agenda that can drive us to think about how we can better support our family caregivers, and so that we can hold the families and also give better support to our older generation. First of all, we have to think about how we can be more responsive to a contextualized caregiving roles. That means not only the female, but also we have male, not only children, but we have children-in-law and grandchildren, and also maybe siblings. And then we have to think about how we can take a life course development perspective. Based on my study together with HSBC and Women's Foundation in Hong Kong, we find that family caregivers, if they quit their jobs, they will cause not only direct causes, but also indirect causes and opportunity cost. So we do have to think about how we can support the family caregivers to balance their roles in family, in caregiving, and also in the workplaces. And then last but not least is how we can facilitate or examine the mechanisms that family caregivers can work out a partnered shared care arrangement together with, for example, the formal caregiver services that provided by the government or non-government organizations, the semi-formal arrangement, for example, the foreign domestic helpers in Hong Kong, in Singapore, and also maybe in other Asian countries, and also the informal shared care that between siblings, between the spouse and the children, and in terms of that kind of shared care. Because originally we might think, okay, there's only one primary family caregivers that will serve the purpose. But now when we look at the very diversified portfolio of caregiving, we must take into consideration. So I will stop my sharing here and hope that we could have more reflections and sharings later on. Thank you.
Vivian, thank you for that terrific overview and giving us something to work with in terms of solutions. So let's hand things now to Pok, and please give us a summary of your research at present and links to Vivian's. Thanks.
Sure, thank you. So first off, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me to join this esteemed panel. So my research has largely tried to understand how demographic change, including fertility decline, greater longevity, increasing migrations, how that shapes family structures and in turn affects intergenerational support system, as well as the well-being of older persons. So I'm interested in addressing these issues in the context of Southeast Asia, particularly in Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, and more recently, Singapore. So Southeast Asia is home to more than 600 million population. The region is very diverse in many respects, including in terms of economic development, cultures, kinship system, as well as the demographic trends. As Professor Chen mentioned earlier, one of the key significant change that happening in Asia is fertility decline. So what this means is that family size is getting smaller. This trend, together with increased dispersion of adult children due to migration, means that older persons are less likely to live with their children these days compared to the past. So let me give you an example. This is data from Thailand. So in 1980s, more than 3/4 of elderly Thai lived with at least one children. So the coincidence rate has been declining continually. More recently, just above half of elderly Thai actually live with their children. Correspondingly, we find that more and more elderly actually live independently, either live alone or live with their spouse. So given that co-residence with adult children is considered the main vehicle for intergenerational support, there are concerns that declining trends in co-residence will have negative implications for all various types of support exchanges across generations. So far, empirical studies find that in terms of material support, it actually may not affect may not be affected so greatly. Material support from adult children does not require physical proximity. Remittances can be sent from any location. So in this photo, an older Thai couple were standing in front of their new house that was built by, was paid for by their adult children. All of them have migrated to Bangkok. And in returns for these material supports, elderly actually help taking care of the grandson so that the parents can focus on their work in the city. So likewise, social support in the form of face-to-face interaction may require physical proximity. However, phone contact does not. Mobile phone has become increasingly available all over Asia, including resourceful countries like Myanmar. So I took this photo in one of my field work a few years ago. So Myanmar, it used to be that mobile phone is very limited in Myanmar just 5 years ago, but nowadays it's everywhere. So this photo shows a poster hung in front of this shack in one of the poor neighborhood outside Yangon. It shows a photo of a grandson holding onto a mobile phone for his grandmother, who is presumably talking to a family member who lives elsewhere. This photo might actually resonate to a lot of us these days when we cannot really get to see our loved one. And this is the way we actually show our support or receive support from family members who live in other locations. So unlike material and social support, personal care support for those who are too frail or chronically ill does require continuous physical presence. This photo is taken from rural Thailand. It shows that elderly daughter are actually taking care of her very old bedridden mothers. So personal care in a lot of Southeast Asian contexts are still primarily done by family members, particularly by female members. So long-term care has been a pressing issue for many governments in Southeast Asia and will continue to be so in the years to come. So in sum, the impacts of demographic changes on intergenerational support system and the well-being of older persons are quite nuanced. So when thinking about future prospect of intergenerational support, these are some of the questions that we may want to ponder. So will fewer and better, but better educated adult children compensate for smaller numbers in relation to material support to elderly parents? Will having fewer or no children allow future elderly to save more for their own support? Will increasing welfare benefits crowd out material support from adult children? Will improved health of elderly allow them to work and support themselves longer? And last but not least, how can families, communities, and state come together to deal with decreased probability that no adult children are nearby when long-term care is needed? So my research has tried to address some of these questions, and I'm happy to share some of the findings during the discussion session. So looking ahead, when thinking about responsibility across generation, it's important to be mindful that current research has tend to focus on the support provided for aging parents by their adult children. Nevertheless, intergenerational support system in Asia are characterized by the norm of reciprocity. So increasingly, researchers, including myself, has tried to pay more attention to the many contributions that older persons give to their families. Additionally, we should also remember that future elderly are likely to have better education. Therefore, they should be able to live independently, to contribute to families as well as to society. And lastly, continuous economic, social, political, and technological change will alter the environment in which future elderly and their family live and support one another. So I just want to leave it at that, and looking forward to share my thoughts and findings in the discussion session. Thank you.
Folk, thank you so much. And let's start out in some of your provocative questions at the end. And I'm going to ask Feinian and Vivian to jump in, but really thinking about the link between our policy responses and what's happening informally. And this notion, I like this idea you brought up, norms of reciprocity, and how we might think about those norms beyond the family unit.
Is that the question for me or for everyone?
Well, why don't you start us out, and then I would love to ask Vivian and Feinian to comment.
Okay. Do you mind repeat your question one more time, please?
Just thinking, I thought, there were some provocative questions at the end, and, thinking about the links between what I might consider sort of in the language of the US, kind of formal, informal supports. Mm-hmm. And then when you brought up this notion of norms of reciprocity. And so I'm wondering, we can think about norms of reciprocity at the family level, but we can also think about norms of reciprocity, right? Kind of politically and from a policy response, and what do generations, regardless of filial context, what do we owe one another in some sense, or what are our expectations from a societal level that we care for our older adults?
Mm-hmm. I think, for example, like the fact that this older couple that I showed the picture were able to help with taking care of grandson, right? So in some way, it's the way that, they enable the younger generations or the adult children to be able to work and pursue economic opportunities. And in returns, these migrant workers or migrant adult children were sending remit monies home for the parents. And it's sort of also, in some of the interviews, we also find that people sort of kind of expect, that when they get old themselves and when they need long-term care, that these adult children and maybe the grandchildren can return those favors that they have sacrificed before. And there's this notion that if your grandparents or your parents do this to you, you kind of owe them something, that you want to sort of return that, favor.
I would like to follow up if possible. So
yes.
What Puck has talked about, all this reciprocity in terms of exchanges and all that. I think in this research, we often talked about intergenerational contract, right? But the form, as Kate, you have mentioned, it's not necessarily a formal one that, the whole family sit down together and draw up this contract in paper, but oftentimes it is implicit in that, if they're contributing early on for the caring for the grandchildren, and then some level of support is expected back. But also there is tremendous variation across the family. So, part of it is, this informal notion of exchange, but a lot of times, as Kate, you mentioned earlier, it's about this, love and intimacy that you build over the years. And this concept of obligation, which is originally, if you think about the East Asian culture in terms of filial piety, that's very much, flowing from the older generation, younger generation up up to the older generations. But now this is, much more mutual, and it's more or less built on the respect, love, and intimacy. So it's constantly evolving.
Vivian?
And yeah, I wish to follow this discussion and bring it to a more micro level that I would like to elaborate more about the shared care phenomenon.
Right.
In a very traditional way, we either think that frail older adults will be taken care by family members or moving into institutions. We call it long-term care facilities, so that they will be entirely taken care by the formal caregivers. So we have this dichotomy between formal and informal. And then when family members, okay, they decided that, okay, my parents will move into long-term care facilities, they will kind of stop bringing care or giving care. Of course, they were still sending a lot of love to them. But now in Hong Kong, what we observe that is that we cannot afford to use this traditional thinking or this dichotomized way to look at the care arrangement, to set up the policies, and also to provide services in our communities. A lot of phenomenon that showed that we have to work towards a shared or partnered care arrangement. What does it mean? For example, in our long-term care facilities, our family members will visit there every day. Even they would have domestic helpers to visit them every day, from 9 o'clock in the morning towards 6 o'clock in the late afternoon. So that is the shared care between formal and the semi-formal and the informal. And then at the home and community care settings, of course, traditionally there is daycare centers, right? And then the senior, older adults will go to daycare centers and come back home and stay with the family members. But nowadays, this might not be the phenomenon. We would have the family members that take the seniors to the daycare center, but they will stay there maybe for half a day, and then they will have half a day their own time, and then they come back home and do things together. So these are the new phenomena that bring us to reflect, what does it mean, family caregiver? How we can make it more future anchored shared care arrangement. So this is the question I think raised by one of the audience. Kathleen, can I follow up one question that raised in the chat room, or I should
From a listener? Of course, yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. So there's a question about how to define the super age or ultra age society. Actually, in our gerontology field, we use 7% as a very distinguished figure. That means if we have 7% of old people that in their old age, we call it an aging society. So when it goes for 14%, it is an aged society. So when it goes to a 21%, we call it super aged. Then 28%, that is ultra aged. So this is how we define this aging society. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I was thinking again about this concept of shared care arrangements, and we have a question from a listener about differences between daughters and sons and the extent to which we might have expectations for caregiving. You've all kind of alluded, right, to this in sort of the larger frame of family structure, but wondering, with more women participating in the labor market, possibly delayed fertility, so people really have very young children when their parents need support, how some of these sorts of phenomena might matter for who steps up to provide care. And Poke, do you want to jump in on that?
Sure. So in my studies of Thailand and Myanmar, so in Thailand, we were able to look, so in both countries, we see that women, particularly daughters, take a lion's share of long-term care for their frail elderly parents. And in Thailand, when you if they report that their sons are the main primary caregivers, they tend to report more unmet needs, that they don't get enough care, or they don't think that the care is satisfactory, right? So what it shows is that there's still, at least in this generation, there's a strong preference for daughters to be primary caregivers. I mean, daughters or wife to be primary caregivers. And that there are this notion that being a woman, you are actually better at providing care for the aging parents. But going forward, as you know, we cannot really beat the demography, right? The fact that people are going to have fewer children, the chance that they won't have daughters will be higher. So if we are not thinking about retrain or make this shift in terms of gender roles, have men participate more in caregiving roles, I think society might face some, unhappiness or, some strains.
Feinian, do you want to comment? Yes, please.
Sure. I would like to add that, in East Asia, for example, or also in India, because of the patriarchal and patrilineal tradition, caregiving, yes, it's very gendered. It's still women doing the lion's shares of it. But oftentimes in these societies, the daughters-in-laws are the one who are providing kind of the day-to-day intimate care for their in-laws. And, in fact, in India recently, in the Indian Human Development Survey that I'm involved with, we're designing a set of questions to, kind of gauge changing norms. Is it acceptable even for daughters to provide help or to live with their aging parents? It's still quite stigmatized. But having said that, things are definitely changing. If you look at urban China, for example, the daughters are definitely doing a lot more in some way, not just in terms of instrumental help, but also in terms of financial support for their parents. They're doing a lot. So in some way, this is also a question that have intrigued me for years. That is, over time, the women are increasingly doing more and more. Not only, they have to work, and at the same time, they're still, trying to follow, in the case of, China, that they want to be good daughter-in-laws. So to provide help, for the in-laws, they consider part of their filial responsibility. But at the same time, because of the love and support that they've been receiving from the parents, they also want to provide care to their own parents. So in a way, it very much, just intensified this work and family conflict for many women in Asia in general.
I'd love for you to follow up on that. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I would say something on behalf of men because I have just finished a study on male caregiving. Yeah. And we actually find that males do have different views in terms of caregiving. And we found that, first of all, they are more problem-solving oriented. So they wish to know more about what does it mean that diseases. They explore for alternatives to solve the problems. They seeking help, search the internet, and consult friends. They do quite a lot of things to work out the solutions. So they are more found into that. But on the other hand, they might be less express their emotions. That doesn't mean that they don't have emotion, they don't have burden, they don't have sadness, but they are less kind of willing to express it in a way that we find that it is very much common or shared among the female caregivers or the daughters. But on the other hand, some of these male caregivers, they expressed that they feel very much intimate when they are providing care to their parents, because they said, oh, I don't have chances to be very close to my parents when I was young. So now it is time for me to fulfill that kind of intimacy. So they have different I would say metaphor in terms of caregiving. And then based on that qualitative study, we have established a website, and also we have an animation. So if you are interested, I can send you the link maybe after this seminar, yeah.
Oh, that would be great. Please send that around. That then leads me to the question of the benefits of caregiving. I think often when we talk about the engagement of older adults and thinking about provision of care, we often use, at least in the US context, this notion of caregiver burden. And I think in our data collection efforts, we often haven't asked good questions about what the benefits or blessings are, what the opportunity might be to forge a more intimate relationship later in life across genders. And so wondering if any of you would like to comment a bit on what those benefits might be.
In fact, I have some studies on the positive aspects of caregiving. First comes from our study based on the dementia caregivers. And then we found that actually the positive aspects of caregiving are much more observed among those who are adapted to that caregiving roles. And of course, are much more found among those who are a bit older in their caregiving years. And then we found two benefits. One is on their self-fulfillment. That means they really feel that I accomplished something. And also recognize their helpfulness and existence to their family care recipients. And then on the other hand, they also enhanced their self-identity and self-esteem. That means they find their life or their self-actualization becomes much more achieved as compared to not taking up that role. And recently, I have been working on the project that's studying the meaning making of the dementia caregivers, so that we can go further and deeper to understand what are the positive aspects of that understanding.
That's great. Hoke, you have some comments on the benefits of caregiving and also thinking more broadly. I mean, your work really draws out these pretty significant changes in family structure. And so when we're thinking about maybe some positive aspects of caregiving, how are we also thinking about maybe expanding our notion of family and what that means, and this idea of fictive kin? Anyway, wondered if you wanted to comment on those ideas.
It's still, I mean, definitely, I think family, I mean, when I show the statistics that, that families still, by and large, be the primary caregivers for people who need have long-term care needs. Usually they were, even though, it seems like almost like even though in some urban middle-class families, they may actually have domestic workers to help, but in Asia, there's still these strong notions that even though you go to work, you spend a lot of time outside home, you actually didn't really give the personal care for your parents, but it's really a moral obligations that, that you need to fulfill, right? And so, it's better to have domestic workers helping you, caring for your aging parents at home than sending them to institutional care, right? But I was reading, this is not from my research, but I think in China, and maybe Feinian and Vivian can jump in, that that has started to, now that institutional care starts to get better in terms of quality, the notions of, and the fact that, people have ways more smaller family size, and the fact that now if you can afford to send your parents to a very nice or high quality nursing home, it's actually considered filial, right? It's second best to, to caring for your parents. So I think that notion has changed, but I think there's still a strong cultural kind of obligations for children in Asia, adult children in Asia, is to be the primary caregivers for their parents if they can. And if they can afford it, they get supported by domestic workers.
Feinian, yeah, please.
Thank you. That's a great point, Poke. I think in terms of filial attitudes, if you look at empirical research recently, the trend has stayed stable and very high. In terms of filial behavior, that has been increasingly, evolving over time. So, first, it used to be that, like you mentioned, sending parents to institutionalized care is considered unfilial and certainly not a desirable behavior. But now, as you said, this is providing the financial support and sending them to the best quality institutionalized care that may very well be redefined as being filial. So that's definitely changing. I also want to add one more point about caregiving. Both Pook and Vivian speak about caring for parents. I also want to add about caring for grandchildren from the perspective of the grandparents. Also have in empirical research I've done and others have done have shown that there are positive aspects involved with that, other than what both of you have mentioned in terms of the sense of fulfillment, the rewards and all that. With caring for young children, oftentimes that also means that it helps to improve their health behavior. They're running around a little bit more. They're more aware of nutrition, diet, those kind of issues. So again, the caveat there is, of course, if you're engaged in very intensive level of care, especially for those grandparents who move from caring from one grandchild to the other and nonstop, that's not too good for your health. But the moderate level amount of caregiving in general, we find it's beneficial both in terms of physical well-being and also subjective well-being.
And I think we're seeing, I know in the US context, a more recent phenomenon where grandparents are moving to be near grandchildren rather than the reverse residential shift, right? Where children would move toward their parents. Now the parents are moving to the kids to help in that kind of care provision. Vivian, do you want to comment on the role of grandparents and thinking about intergenerational transmission of knowledge or care?
Yeah, I would say, in Hong Kong, since we do have this domestic helper phenomenon, that means quite a lot of families, they will hire a domestic helper to taking care of the grandchildren, but grandparents still, they play a very significant role in, for example, supervise the domestic helpers and also do some knowledge exchange. But what we found in the Asia context is that we might have to take generations into consideration when we think about or talk about caregiving. A few years ago, I have conducted studies on 3 generations in regard with how they experience grandparenting. We found that there are a little bit differences between the grandparents' generation and also the parents' generation in terms of what would be expected as a nice grandparents or a responsible grandparents or a respectful grandparents. And in general sense, grandparents would consider themselves as much more important as compared to in the eyes of the parents' generation. From parents' generation, they might have different views. They might think, oh, because I don't have time, so that you come to help. But grandparents would regard themselves as much more significance in terms of the moral education, also knowledge exchange, and also the cultural heritage responsibilities. So this is something we might need to go into deeper.
And it strikes me as we're talking about caregiving more broadly, of course, in the challenge related to COVID and why we find ourselves on this webinar today, right, and not in the same space, is that we have to be very careful about in-person interaction. And so you know, that leads me to questions about kind of distal interaction and its benefits. We mentioned social media earlier, how that might matter. And, you know, if you have some suggestions for our listeners about how to engage across generations, particularly in this historic moment. Hope, do you want to start us out?
I think technology is, has, as we all experience it, has been very helpful when it comes to, us trying to connect with, like say my families in Thailand or Feinian, in China, right? But I think something that we need to be aware of is the sort of, inequality when it comes to access to technology, right?
Yes, exactly.
And then the generational gap as well, right? So some parents or aging parents may not be able to, maneuver all these gadgets, right? And in poor or setting, they might not be able to afford these kind of things, which will make it harder for people to remain connected with their family and provide the social support or material support using technology. So I think something that policymakers should actually think about that too. I mean, a lot of has been focused on giving laptop or computer to students that they can study during COVID, but we haven't really talked about technology that connect different generations in the time of COVID.
That's a fantastic point. Feinian, do you want to comment on?
I agree with Pope completely. The access issue is definitely, what's driving the differences across these different groups. But I want to bring in the positive point about grandchildren's role. Just like anecdotally, I see my children, they help their grandparents quite a bit because during this period of lockdown, they're definitely looking for things to do. And they've been talking to the grandparents regularly, and they've been teaching their grandparents about, how to use these different functions, how to like certain posts. So in many ways, I do think that this bond that developed over time, it's not just, it's of course based on all this love and intimacy, but at the same time, it can have, functional meaning too in terms of facilitating and helping learning. And I think they do a much better job than me in terms of helping the older parents and grandparents.
Vivian?
Yeah, I just want to add one point that's on when we talk about the digital divide between the generations, we might also need to take into consideration of how social distancing would have an impact on those who are living alone or whose parents they're living separately in different places, different countries, different communities, because during a certain period of time, even in Hong Kong, we are very, very cautious to going out. So some of the children may recommend their parents not going out. We are not allowed you to going out. So they will, in Hong Kong, they will deliver, they will online ordering or even deliver the groceries to their parents. But that might have, the negative impact on their parents' life because their parents become less active, they stop doing exercises, not doing this and that, even not cooking food, So that we have to balance, how measures that can prevent the infection of virus, that means social distancing, but also the need and urge for humans to being connected with each other.
So it's always hard to believe that this hour comes to a close because I feel like this conversation is just beginning and it goes so quickly, but wondered if anyone wanted to share some closing comments, suggestions for people in terms of how to connect during this period of time, some additional reading, or again, ideas about how we might reframe what caregiving means. Feini, do you want to
And
summary statement to share? Yeah.
yeah, I just want to re-emphasize what I shared before. I would say that we must look at the future anchored present. That means we have to look at the future and then to prepare ourselves in terms of research, in terms of policy, and in terms of program to work on this partnership shared care.
I would like to add that I like that very much in terms of future anchor, but also looking cross-nationally or looking at other countries' experience and not at different stages of the population aging process. I think we have a lot to learn from each other as well.
Right, and thinking about even structuring data collection and data resources that are comparative from the onset. Hope?
Sure. So I just want to reemphasize that in order to plan for, addressing these kind of issues, we need to rely on empirical data, right? And context is shifting. And there's compositional change as well in terms of the characteristics of older people. Older people today will be different from the next generations of older people. So I think there's a role for social scientists to contribute to this empirical evidence to get policy makers more informed.
That is a terrific point. And as we know, age, period, and cohort matter a lot for how social phenomena evolve. Well, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time today and responding to the questions from our listeners. Poke, Vinny, and Vivian. And I know I should share with all the listeners too that you've all known one another for quite some time and have been interacting in scholarly space. And so I think you can feel from the conversation today, you're both generous listeners, but also really are well aware of the research contributions of your colleagues here. And I think that's really enriched our conversation. So thank you so much. And I just want to share with the listeners too that we'll be gathering again July 16th to think about social safety nets. And I think that's a very nice link to what the three of you have set up today.
Thank you.
Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.